Hello, everybody. I'm so glad to see you. You're seeing me in a different room tonight. I'm trying out a nice high wing-back armchair, sort of like the one Uncle Andrew liked to sit in front of his fire. Just thought I'd try something different for tonight. Well, what an exciting chapter that was we read yesterday. Do you remember that Shasta and Aravis raced and raced across the desert to try to beat Rabadash's army who were coming to defeat King Loon and take over the country of Archenland? And a lion chased them and scratched Aravis on her back, and they just escaped into a quiet little green circular enclosure with a strange man with a brown robe on who took care of Aravis, but meanwhile he told Shasta that if he wanted to get to Anvard Castle, he'd better run, and not stop running until he got there. You know, I think this light is sort of shining in my eyes. If you don't mind, I'm just going to take off my glasses. Will that make me look really weird? Well, maybe you'd rather see me weird without glasses instead of weird with a reflection shining on them. So I'm going to take them off and just read without them. When Shasta went through the gate, he found a slope of grass and a little heather running up before him to some trees. He had nothing to think about now and no plans to make. He only had to run, and that was quite enough. His limbs were shaking, and a terrible pain was beginning to form in his side. Here's a picture of Shasta running through the trees there to get to King Loon. And the sweat that kept dripping into his eyes blinded them and made them sting. He was unsteady on his feet, too, and more than once he nearly turned his ankle on a loose stone. The trees were thicker now than they had been, and in the more open spaces there was bracken. The sun had gone in without making it any cooler. It had become one of those hot, gray days when there seemed to be twice as many flies as usual. Shasta's face was covered with them, but he didn't even try to shake them off. He had too much else to do. Suddenly he heard a horn. Not a great throbbing horn like the horns of the gates of Tashbaan, but a merry call. Doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Next moment, he came out into a wide glade and found himself in a crowd of people. At least it looked like a crowd to him. Probably about 15 or 20 of them, all gentlemen in green hunting dress, with their horses. Some were still in the saddle, and some were standing by their horses' sides. In the center, someone was holding the stirrup for a man who was about to mount. And the man that he was holding it for was the jolliest, plump, apple-cheeked, twinkly-eyed king you could imagine. As soon as Shasta came in sight of this king, the king forgot about mounting his horse. He spread out his arms to Shasta. His face lit up, and in a great deep voice that seemed to come from the bottom of his chest, he said, "Corin, my son, and on foot, and in rags. What?" "No," panted Shasta, shaking his head. "Not Prince Corin. I know I look like him. I saw His Highness in Tashbaan. He sends his greetings." The king was staring at Shasta with an extraordinary expression on his face. "Are you King Loon?" gasped Shasta. And then, without waiting for an answer, "Lord King Loon, fly, hurry! Anvard, the enemies are upon you, Rabadash and 200 soldiers." "Have you assurance of this, my boy?" asked one of the other gentlemen. "My own eyes," said Shasta. "I've seen them. I raced them all the way from Tashbaan." "On foot?" asked the gentleman, raising his eyebrows a little. "On horses, with the hermit." "Question him no more, Darren," said King Loon. "I see truth in his face. We must ride for it, gentlemen. A spare horse for the boy. You can ride fast, friend." For an answer, Shasta put his foot in the stirrup of the horse which had been led toward him, and a moment later he was in the saddle. He had done it 100 times with Bree in the last few weeks, and his mounting was now very different from it had been in the beginning, when Bree had told him that he climbed up a horse as if he were climbing up a haystack. He was pleased to hear Lord Darren say to the king, "That boy has a true horseman's seat. I warrant there's noble blood in him." "His blood, aye, that's the point," said the king. And he stared hard at Shasta again with that curious expression, almost a hungry expression, in his steady gray eyes. But by now the whole party was moving off at a brisk canter. Shasta's seat was excellent, but he was sadly puzzled about what to do with the reins. He had never touched the reins when he was on Bree's back, but he looked carefully out of the corner of his eye to see what the others were doing, the way some of us is done when we're at a party and we're not quite sure which knife or fork we should use. But he didn't dare try really directing the horse. He trusted that it would follow the rest. The horse was, of course, an ordinary horse, not a talking horse, for it was quite wise enough, though, to realize that the strange boy on his back had no whip and no spurs and was not really master of the situation. That was why Shasta soon found himself at the tail end of the procession. Even so, they were going pretty fast. There were no flies now, and the air in his face was delicious. He had got his breath back, too, and his errand had succeeded. For the first time since his arrival in Tashbaan, how long ago that seemed, he was prepared to enjoy himself. He looked up to see how much nearer the mountaintops had come. To his disappointment, he couldn't see them at all. Only a vague grayness rolling down toward them. He had never been in mountain country before, and he was surprised. "It's a cloud," he said to himself. "It's a cloud coming down, I see. Up here in the hills, one really is up in the sky. I shall see what the inside of a cloud looks like. I've never seen one before." Far away on his left, and a little way behind him, the sun was already beginning to set. They had come to a rough kind of road by now, and were making very good speed. But Shasta's horse was still the last of the lot. Once in a while, when the road made a turn, and there were now continuous bends on either and forest on either side, he had lost sight of the others for a second or two. Then they plunged into the fog, or else the fog rolled over them, and the world became gray. Shasta had not realized how cold and dark and wet it is inside a cloud. The gray turned to black with alarming speed. Someone at the head of the column blew the horn every now and then, and each time the sound seemed to be a little farther off. He couldn't see any of the others now, but of course he'd be able to as soon as he got around the next bend. But when he rounded the next bend, he still couldn't see them. In fact, he couldn't see anything at all. He and his horse were just walking now. "Get on, horse, get on," said Shasta. And then came the horn, very faint. Bree had always told him that he must keep his heels turned out, and Shasta had gotten the idea that something very terrible would happen if he dug his heels into a horse's side. But this seemed to be the occasion for trying it. "Look here, horse," he said, "if you don't hurry up, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to dig my heels into you really hard. I will." The horse, however, took no notice of this threat. So Shasta settled himself firmly in the saddle, gripped with his knees, clenched his teeth, and punched the horse's side with his heels as hard as he could. The only result was that the horse broke into a kind of pretense of a trot for 5 or 6 paces, and then subdued back into a walk again. And now it was quite dark, and they seemed to have given up blowing that horn. The only sound was a steady drip, drip from the branches of the trees. "Well, I suppose even a walk will get us somewhere sometime," said Shasta to himself. "I only hope I don't run into Rabbitash and his people." He went on for what seemed like a long time, always at a walking pace. He began to hate that horse, and he was already very hungry. Presently, they came to a place where the road divided into two. He was just wondering which led to Anvard when he was startled by a noise from behind him. It was the noise of trotting horses. Rapidash, thought Shasta. He had no way of guessing which road Rapidash would take. But if I take one, he may take the other. And if I stay at the crossroads, I'm sure to be caught. So he dismounted and led his horse as quickly as he could along the right-handed road. The sound of the cavalry grew rapidly nearer, and in a moment or two, Shasta realized that they were at the crossroads. He held his breath, waiting to see which way they would take. There came a low word of command, "Halt!" Then a moment of horsey noises, nostrils blowing, hoofs pawing, bits being champed, necks being padded, and then a voice spoke. "Listen, all of you," it said. "We are now within a furlong of the castle. Remember your orders. Once we are in Narnia, as we should be by sunrise, you are to kill as little as possible. On this venture, you are to regard every drop of Narnian blood as being 1,000 more times more valuable than a gallon of your own. On this venture, I say. The gods will send us on a happier hour, and then you must leave nothing alive between Cair Paravel and the Western Waste. But we are not there yet in Narnia. Here in Archenland, though, it is a different thing. In the assault on this castle of King Lune, nothing matters but speed. Show your mettle. It must be mine within the hour. If it is, I give it all to you. I will keep no booty for myself. You kill me every barbarian male within its walls, down to the child that was born yesterday, and everything else is yours to take. The gold, the jewels, the weapons, the women, the wine. If I see anyone hanging back when we come to the gates, I'll burn them alive. In the name of Tash, the irresistible, the inexorable, forward!" With a great clippity-clop, the column began to move, and Shasta breathed again. They had taken the other road. Shasta thought they took a long time going past, for though he had been talking and thinking about 200 horses and horsemen all day, he hadn't really realized how many that was. But eventually the sound died away, and once more he was alone with the drip, drip of the trees. He now knew the way to Anvard, but of course he couldn't go there. That would only mean running into the arms of Rapidash's troopers. "What on earth am I to do?" Shasta said to himself. But he remounted his horse and continued along the road he had chosen, in the faint hope of finding some cottage where he might ask for shelter and a meal. He had thought, of course, of going back to Aravis and Bree and Hwyn, but he couldn't remember by now any. He had no idea of the direction that he had come from. "After all," said Shasta, "this road is bound to get somewhere." But that all depends on what you mean by somewhere. The road kept on going, and it's kept on going somewhere in the sense that it got to be more and more trees, all dark and dripping, and to colder and colder air. And strange icy winds kept blowing down the road past him and blowing the mist, although they never blew it away. If he had been used to mountain country, he would have realized that this meant he was now very high up, perhaps right at the top of the pass. But Shasta knew nothing about mountains. "I do think," said Shasta, "that I must be the most unfortunate boy that ever lived. I must be the most unfortunate boy in the whole world. Everything goes right for everybody else except me. Those Narnian lords and ladies got away safely from Tashbaan, and I was left behind. Aravis and Bree and Hwyn are as snug as anything with that old hermit, and I was the one who was sent on to King Lune and his people, and they probably got back safely to the castle and shut the gates long before Rapidash gets there, but I'm left out." And being very tired and having nothing inside him, He felt so sorry for himself that tears rolled down his cheeks. What put a stop to all this, though, was a sudden fright. Shasta discovered that someone or something was walking beside him. It was pitch dark, and he could see nothing. And the thing or person was going so quietly that he could hardly hear any footfalls. What he could hear was breathing. The invisible companion seemed to breathe on a very large scale. And Shasta got the impression that it was a very large creature. And he had come to notice this breathing so gradually that he really had no idea how long it had been there. It was a horrible shock. The thing, unless it was a person, went on beside him so very quietly that Shasta began to hope that he had only imagined it. But just as he was becoming quite sure he had imagined it, there suddenly came a deep, rich sigh out of the darkness beside him. It couldn't be his imagination. Anyway, he had felt the warm breath of that sigh on his chilly left hand. If the horse had been any good, or if he had known how to get any good out of the horse, he would have risked everything on a breakaway gallop. But he knew he couldn't make that horse gallop, so he went on at a walking pace, and the unseen companion walked and breathed beside him. At last he couldn't bear it any longer. "Who are you?" he said, scarcely above a whisper. "One who has waited long for you to speak," said the thing. Its voice was not loud, but very large and deep. Are you a giant?" asked Shasta. "You might call me a giant," said the large voice, "but I am not like the creature you call giants." "I can't see you at all," said Shasta, after staring very hard. Then, for an even more terrible idea had come into his head, he said almost in a scream, You're not something dead, are you?" "Oh, please do go away. What harm have I done you? Oh, I am the most unlucky person in the whole world." Once more he felt the warm breath of the thing on his hand and his face. "There," he said, "that is not the breath of a ghost. Tell me your sorrows." Shasta was a little reassured by the breath, and so he told how he had never known his real father or mother and had been brought up sternly by the fishermen. And then he told the story of his escape and how they were chased by lions and forced to swim for their lives, and all of the dangers of Tashbaan, and about the night among the tombs, and how beasts howled all around him out of the desert. And he told about the heat and the thirst of that desert journey, and how they were almost at their goal when another lion had chased them and wounded Aravis. And also how very long it was since he had had anything to eat. "I do not call you unfortunate," said the large voice. "Don't you think it was bad luck to meet so many lions?" "There was only one lion." "What on earth do you mean? I've just told you that there were at least two the first night." "There was only one, but he was swift of foot." "But how do you know?" "I was that lion." And as Shasta gaped with an open mouth and said something, the voice continued, "I was the lion who forced you to join Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackal from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for the last mile so that you would reach King Loon in time. And I was the lion you do not remember who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death, so that it came up to the shore where a man sat wakeful at midnight to receive you." "Then it was you who wounded Aravis?" "It was I." "Story. Not here, I tell, not hers. I tell no one any story but his own." "Who are you?" said Shasta. "Myself," said the voice, very deep and low, so that the earth shook. And again, "Myself," loud and clear. And then the third time, "Myself," whispered so softly that you could hardly hear it. And yet it seemed to come from all around you as the leaves rustled with it. Shasta was no longer afraid that the voice belonged to something that would eat him, nor that it was the voice of a ghost, for a new and different sort of trembling came over him. Yet he felt glad, too. The mist was turning from black to gray, and from gray to white. This must have been happening for some time, but while he had been talking to the thing, he had not noticed anything else. But now the whiteness around him became a shining whiteness, and his eyes began to blink. Somewhere ahead, he could hear birds singing. He knew that the night was over at last. He could see the mane and the ears and the head of his horse quite easily now. A golden light fell on them from the left, and he thought it was the sun. He turned and saw, pacing beside him, taller than the horse, a lion. The horse did not seem to be afraid of it, or maybe he couldn't see it. But it was from the lion that the light was coming. No one ever saw anything more terrible or beautiful. Luckily, Shasta had lived all his life too far south in Calormen to have heard the tales that were whispered in Tashbaan about a dreadful Narnian demon that appeared in the form of a lion. And of course, he knew none of the true stories about Aslan, the great lion, the son of the emperor beyond the sea, the king above all high kings in Narnia. But after one glance at the lion's face, he slipped out of the saddle and fell at his feet. He couldn't say anything, but then he didn't want to say anything, and he knew he didn't need to say anything. The high king above all kings stepped forward toward him. His mane, now strange and solemn perfume that hung about the mane, was all around him. It touched his forehead with his tongue. He lifted his face, and their eyes met. Then instantly, the pale brightness of the mist and the fiery brightness of the lion rolled themselves together into a swirling glory and gathered themselves and disappeared. He was alone with the horse on a grassy hillside under a blue sky, and there were birds singing. Do we know who that lion was? Oh, yes. Yes, we do. It was the Lord Jesus. When he said, "Myself," does that remind you of when Moses asked God what his name was, and he said, "I am"? Now we're going to read about Shasta in Narnia. Chapter 12. Was it all a dream? Wondered Shasta. But it couldn't have been a dream, for there in the grass before him he saw the deep, large print of the lion's front right paw. It took one's breath away to think of the weight that could make a footprint like that. But there was something else remarkable about it. As he looked at it, water had already filled the bottom of it, and soon it was full to the brim and then overflowing, and a little stream was running downhill past him over the grass. Shasta stooped and drank, a very long drink, and then dipped his face in it and splashed his head. It was extremely cold and clear as glass, and it refreshed him very much. After he stood up, shaking the water out of his ears and flinging the wet hair back from his forehead, he began to take stock of their surroundings. Apparently, it was still very early in the morning. The sun had only just risen, and it had risen out of the forests which he had seen low down and far away on his right. The country which he was looking at was absolutely new to him. It was a green valley land dotted with trees throughout, and he caught the glimpse of a river that wound away roughly to the northwest. On the far side of the valley, there were some high and sort of rocky hills, but they were lower than the mountains he had seen yesterday, and he began to guess where he was. He turned and looked behind him, and saw that the slope on which he was standing belonged to the range of higher mountains. I see, said Shasta to himself. Those are the big mountains that separate Archenland from Narnia. I was on the other side of them yesterday. I must have come through the pass in the night. What good luck that I hit it. At least it wasn't luck at all. It was that lion. It was him. And now I'm in Narnia. He turned and unsaddled his horse and took off its bridle. Though you are a perfectly horrid horse, he said. And it took no notice of him whatsoever, and immediately began eating grass. The horse also had a very low opinion of Shasta. I wish I could eat grass, thought Shasta. It's no good going back to Anvard, because it's besieged now. I'd better get lower down into the valley and see if I can find something to eat. So he went on downhill. The thick dew was cruelly cold to his bare feet, till he came to a wood. There was a kind of track running through it, and he had not followed this for many minutes when he came to a thick and rather wheezy voice saying to him, Good morning, neighbor. Shasta looked around eagerly to find the speaker, and saw presently that it was a small, prickly person with a dark face, who had just come out from among the trees. Here's that dark, prickly person. It was very small for a person, but very big indeed for a hedgehog, but that was what it was. Good morning, said Shasta, but I'm not a neighbor. In fact, I'm a stranger in these parts. Ah, said the hedgehog inquiringly. I've come over the mountains from Archenland, you know. Ah, Archenland, said the hedgehog. That's a terribly long way. Never been there myself. And I think, perhaps, said Shasta, that someone ought to be told that there's an army of savage Calormenes attacking Anvard, all at this very moment. You don't say so, said the hedgehog. Well, think of that. And they do say that Calormen is hundreds and thousands of miles away, right at the world's end, across a great sea of sand. Well, it's not nearly that far, said Shasta. And something should be done, surely, about this attack at Anvard. Shouldn't your high king be told? Oh, certainly, sure, something ought to be done about it, said the hedgehog. But you see, I was just on my way to bed for a good day's sleep. Goodbye, neighbor. But these last words were spoken to an immense biscuit-covered rabbit, whose head had just popped up from somewhere near the path. Just learned from Shasta, and the rabbit agreed that this was very remarkable news, and that someone ought to tell someone about it with a view to telling somebody something and doing something. And so it went on. Every few minutes they were joined by other creatures from the branches overhead, from the little underground houses at their feet, till the party consisted of 5 rabbits, a squirrel, 2 magpies, a goat-footed fawn, and a mouse, who all talked at the same time and all agreed with the hedgehog. For the truth of the matter was that in that golden age when the witch in the winter had gone and Peter the High King was ruling at Cair Paravel, the smaller woodland people of Narnia were so safe and happy that they were getting a little careless. Presently, however, 2 more practical people arrived in the little wood. One was a red dwarf, whose name was Duffel. The other was a stag, a beautiful, lordly creature with wide, liquid eyes, dappled flanks and legs, so thin and graceful that they looked as if you could break them with 2 fingers. You know, a stag is a kind of deer, a big deer. And dappled means that he was spotted with different shades of gray. Lion alive, roared the dwarf as soon as he heard the news. And if that's so, why are we all standing still chattering? Enemies at Anvard, news must be sent to Cair Paravel at once. The army must be called out. Narnia must go to the aid of King Loon. Ah, said the hedgehog, but you won't find the High King at Cair Paravel. He's away to the north, trouncing those giants. And talking of giants, neighbor, that reminds me. Well, who will take our message? Interrupted the dwarf. Anybody here got more speed than me? I've got speed, said the stag. What's my message? How many Calormenes? 200 under Prince Rabadash, but the stag was already away, all four legs off the ground at once, and in a moment its white stern had disappeared among the remoter trees. I wonder where he's going, said the rabbit. He won't find the High King at Caraparavel, you know. He'll find Queen Lucy there, said Duffel. And then, hello, what's wrong with the human? It's looking pretty green. I do believe it's ready to faint. Perhaps it's mortal hungry. When did you last have a meal, youngster? Yesterday morning, said Shasta weakly. Come on then, said the dwarf, throwing his thick little arms around Shasta's weight to hold him up. Why, neighbors, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. You come with me, lad, breakfast, much better than talking. With a great deal of bustle, muttering reproaches to himself, the dwarf half led and half carried Shasta a great speed down into the wood and down a little hill. It was a longer walk than Shasta wanted at that moment, and his legs had begun to feel very shaky before he came out from the trees on the bare hillside. Then they found a little house with a smoking chimney and an open door, and they ducked down and came into the doorway of Duffel's house. And Duffel called out, Hey, brothers, a visitor for breakfast. And immediately, mixed with a sizzling sound, there came to Shasta a delightful smell. It was one he had never smelled in his life before, but you probably have. In fact, it was the smell of bacon and eggs and mushrooms frying in a pan. Mind your head, lad, said Duffel, a moment too late, for Shasta had already bashed his forehead against the low lintel of the door. Now, continued the dwarf, sit you down. The table's a little low for you, but the stool's low too. And here's some porridge, and here's a jug of cream, and here's a spoon. By the time Shasta had finished his porridge, the dwarf's two brothers, whose names were Boggle and Bricklethumb, were putting a dish of bacon and eggs and mushroom and the coffee pot and hot milk and toast on the table. It was all new and wonderful to Shasta, for Kellerman food is quite different. He didn't even know what the slices of brown stuff were, for he had never seen toast before. He didn't know what the yellow soft thing was that they smeared on the toast, because in Kellerman you nearly always get oil instead of butter. And the house itself was quite different from the dark, fish-smelling hut of Arshish and from the pillared and carpeted halls of the great Tashbaan. The roof was very low, and everything was made of wood. And there was a cuckoo clock and a red and white check tablecloth and a bowl of flowers and little curtains on thick paned windows. It was also rather troublesome having to use dwarf cups and plates and knives and forks, but that meant that helpings were very small. But there were also a great many of them, so that Shasta's plate or cup was being filled every moment, and every moment the dwarfs were saying, A butter, please, or another cup of coffee, or I'd like a few more mushrooms, or how about frying another egg or so? And when at last they had all eaten as much as they possibly could, the dwarfs drew lots for who would do the washing up, and Rogan was the unlucky one. Then Duffel and Bricklethumb took Shasta outside to a bench which ran along the cottage wall, and they all stretched out their legs and gave a great sigh of contentment, and the two dwarfs lit their pipes. The dew was off the grass now, and the sun was very warm. Indeed, if there hadn't been a light breeze, it would have been too hot. Now, stranger, said Duffel, I'll show you the lie of the land. You can see nearly all of South Narnia from here, and we're rather proud of the view. Right away on your left, beyond those near hills, you could just see the western mountains. And the round hill away on your right is called the Hill of the Stone Table. And just beyond, but at that instant he was interrupted by a snore from Shasta, who, what with last night's journey and this excellent breakfast, had gone fast asleep. The kindly dwarfs, as soon as they noticed this, began making signs to each other not to wake him. And indeed, they did so much whispering and nodding and getting up and tiptoeing away that they certainly would have woken him up had he been less tired. He slept pretty well all that day, but woke up in time for supper. The beds in that house were all too small for him, but they made him a fine bed of heather on the floor, and he never stirred or dreamed all night. The next morning they had just finished breakfast when they heard a shrill, exciting sound from outside. "Trumpets," said the dwarf, and they and Shasta all came like the horns of Tashbaan, or gay and merry like King Lun's hunting horns, but clear and valiant and sharp. The noise was coming from the woods to the east, and soon there was a noise of horses' hoofs mixed with it. A moment later, the head of the column came in sight. First came the Lord Paradan on a bay horse carrying the great banner of Narnia, a red lion on a green background. Shasta knew him at once. And then came 3 people riding abreast, 2 on great horses and 1 on a pony. The 2 on the chargers were King Edmund and a fair-haired lady with a merry face, who wore a helmet and a mail shirt and carried a bow across her shoulder and a quiver full of arrows at her side. "That's Queen Lucy," whispered Duffel. But on the pony was Corin. And after that came the main body of the army, on ordinary horses, men on talking horses who didn't mind being ridden on proper occasions, as when Narnia went to war, centaurs, stern, hard-bitten bears, great talking dogs, and last of all, 6 giants. For there are good giants in Narnia, but though he knew they were on the right side, Shasta at first could hardly bear to look at them. There are some things that take a lot of getting used to. Just as the king and queen reached the cottage, and the dwarfs began making low bows to them, King Edmund called out, "Now, friends, time for a halt and a morsel to eat." And at once there was a great bustle of people dismounting, and backpacks being opened, and conversations beginning, when Corin came running up to Shasta and seized both his hands and cried, "What? You're here! So you got through all right. I am glad. Now we shall have some sport, and isn't it luck? We only just got into the harbor at Cair Paravel yesterday morning, and the very first person who met us was Chervy the stag, and this news about an attack on Anvard. Don't you think?" "Who is your highness's friend?" said King Edmund, who had just gotten off his horse. I should show you a picture first. Here's the picture of the procession coming through. There's the giants at the back there, and Lucy and Edmund and Corin at the front, and the banner of Narnia with the lion on the green background. Let's see. Oh, yes, I need to turn the page, don't I? Oh, yes. "Don't you see, sire," said Corin, "it's my double, the boy you mistook for me in Tashbaan." "Why, so he is your double," exclaimed Queen Lucy. "You're as like as 2 twins. Isn't this a marvelous thing?" "Please, your majesty," said Shasta to King Edmund, "I am no traitor, really. I really wasn't, and I couldn't help overhearing your plans, but I would never have dreamed of telling them to your enemies." "I know now that you were no traitor, boy," said King Edmund, laying his hand on Shasta's head. "But if you wouldn't be taken for one, then next time try not to hear what's meant for others' ears. But all is well." After that, there was so much bustle and talk and coming and going that Shasta for a few minutes lost sight of Corin and Edmund and Lucy. But Corin was the sort of boy who one is sure to hear plenty of, and it wasn't long before Shasta heard King Edmund saying in a loud voice, "By the lion's mane, Prince, this is too much. Will your highness never be better? You are more of a heart scald than our whole army put together. I wish I had a regiment of hornets in my command rather than you." Shasta wormed his way through the crowd, and there he saw Edmund looking very angry indeed, and Corin looking a little ashamed of himself. A strange dwarf was sitting on the ground making faces. A couple of fawns had apparently been helping him out of his armor. "If I just had my cordial with me," Queen Lucy was saying, "I could soon mend this, but the High King has so strictly charged me not to carry it commonly to the wars, and to only keep it for great extremities." What had happened was this. As soon as Corin had spoken to Shasta, Corin's elbow had been plucked by a dwarf in the army called Thornbutt. "What is it, Thornbutt?" Corin had asked. "Your Royal Highness," said Thornbutt, drawing him aside, "our march today will bring us through the pass and right to your royal father's castle. We may be in battle before night." "I know," said Corin. "Isn't it splendid?" "Splendid or not," said Thornbutt, "I have the strictest orders from King Edmund to see to it that you, your Highness, are not in the fight. You will be allowed to see it, and that is treat enough for someone of your tender years." "What nonsense!" Corin burst out. "Of course I'm going to fight. Why, Queen Lucy is going to be there with the archers." "The Queen will do as she pleases," said Thornbutt, "but you are in my charge. Either I must have your solemn and princely word that you will keep your pony beside mine and not half a neck ahead of it, or I give your Highness leave to depart right now. Or else, if it is His Majesty's word, we must go with our wrists tied together like two prisoners." "I'll knock you down if you try to lay a hand on me," said Corin. "I'd like to see your Highness do it," said the dwarf. That was quite enough for a boy like Corin, and in a second he and the dwarf were at it hammer and tongs. It would have been an even match, for though Corin had longer arms and more height, the dwarf was older and tougher. But it was never fought out. That's the worst of fights on a rough hillside, for by very bad luck Thornbutt trod on a loose stone, fell down flat on his nose, and found that when he tried to get up he had sprained his ankle. A real excruciating sprain, which would keep him from walking or riding for at least 2 weeks. "See what your Highness has done," said King Edmund. "You've deprived me of a proven warrior on the very edge of battle." "I'll take his place, sire," said Corin. "Pshaw," said Edmund. "No one doubts your courage, but a boy in battle is a danger only to his own side." And at that moment the king was called away to attend to something else, and Corin, after apologizing handsomely to the dwarf, rushed up to Shasta and whispered, "Quick, there's a spare pony now, and the dwarf's armor. Put it on before anybody notices." "What for?" said Shasta. "Why, so you and I can fight at the battle, of course. Don't you want to?" Said Shasta. But he hadn't been thinking about doing that at all, and began to get a most uncomfortable, prickly feeling in his spine. "That's right," said Corin. "Over your head, now the sword belt, but we must ride near the tail of the column and keep as quiet as mice. But once the battle begins, everyone will be far too busy to notice us." You think? That's the end of chapter 12. And that was exciting, wasn't it? But I think chapter 13 is going to be even more exciting. I hope you'll be back, and I'll be back, and we'll get together and read this some more. Thanks for joining me tonight. Bye for now, everybody.